Welcome to Eviliv3, the live media commentary show that answers the question, do you have to watch Lord of the Rings to understand this book? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Clanlands in New Zealand, Kiwis, Kilts, and Adventure Down Under. All right, so this was written by Heughan and Graham McTavish. It was actually ghost written as well by Charlotte Reather. She was a part of the original Clanlands, which was an exploration of Scotland and literally Scottish clans' lands, hence the name. And Graham McTavish and Heughan are, of course, from the Outlander series fame. We don't need to go into all that because this is less about Scottish culture, kind of, and more about New Zealander or Maori culture, which I found really interesting. When I first realized that they were making this second season, it was sort of teased at the end of the first season. And this is actually where Graham McTavish lives now after having done The Lord of the Rings, falling in love with New Zealand. He upended his life and just moved, or I don't know, arguably stayed in New Zealand from then on. Of course, let me get the book up here. And so he just sort of fell in love with it. And so he figured since they already did Scotland, actually Heughan really wants to do more Scotland and even like the Hebrides Islands or something like that. And then maybe even Scandinavian stuff. So they've got a bunch of other ideas of different locations to go visit and stuff, which I really appreciate. But they decided to focus on New Zealand again because this is where Graham McTavish is living. And they started doing this before the pandemic, planning it. And so when they finally got to start recording it, they had to deal with all of the pandemic's sort of weights. Like if you come into country in New Zealand, they're really fervent about making sure no one gets into their country with COVID-19. And so they had to sit around for 10, 15 days, which sort of drove Heughan crazy, but they were insane about how restrictive they were. Arguably for good reason, but in either case, that's part of this story as well. So it's going to be ever present reading this novel. I don't even know if you can call it a novel, this sort of short story of their experience in New Zealand. So the original Clanlands, which is based off of Men in Kilts TV series, it was pretty good. You know, I remember giving it, I think I gave it like 4 evil eyes or something like that. I enjoyed it. The problem was that they would retread old ground because basically each chapter is a day. And so Sam will go in and talk about the day, and then Graham will come in and talk about the day. And so you're getting overlap a lot. Part of the fun of that overlap is that they comment on each other's experiences and notes in the novel. And so you're getting these sort of, as if they were sitting next to each other, interjecting thoughts while one person was talking. It creates a very conversational, natural rhythm to the read, which was a little upsetting to me in the first Clanlands. In this one, I don't know if I'm just used to it or if it worked better. I honestly don't know which it is, but I actually didn't mind it as much in this version. And as much as I found myself laughing out loud in the first book, this book, I was also laughing out loud quite a few times, mainly at Graham's expense because he's such a hilarious author when it comes down to writing. His anecdotes are fantastic. But aside from the humorous and the actors and the setting and stuff, it actually does dive in a fair amount into history. And what I appreciated about it is because I don't know anything about Maori history. I didn't know anything about New Zealander history. It broke it down on how it was originally colonized by the Polynesians. I think it was in like the 13th century or something like that. And then it was the Maori were much like the Scots in the Highlands, where it was clan-based life. Well, the Maori had tribe-based life, and there was a lot of warring and crazy stuff going on until the English came over under the guise of this insane sort of religious nut job Scotsmen, and a bunch of other colonists came in and then started populating the islands. And they brought with them muskets, guns, which the Maori had none of. And so the Maori would, of course, welcome them in, trade for the rifles, and then use the rifles to war against each other. And so the history of arguably the known history of the Maori culture on New Zealand, terrain and everything, very much resembles the history of the Scottish Highlands and their clan system. And I found that connection rather endearing and interesting. Again, I'm an American. I have Scottish ancestry, which I love to cling on to, and I love to read about the stories and the histories and everything. The Clan Campbell Society of North America has a really great series of 3 massive novels written by Alistair Campbell, who's actually a well-known and awarded historian. But he goes into all history of Clan Campbell from the very beginning of early history to today, whenever he finished writing it like a decade or 2 ago. But great series of books, very history, so it can be very dry, but very, very interesting to me. And I just love the parallels between all of these primitive cultures, regardless of where they are, what island they happen to be on, northern or southern hemisphere, and how the tribal lifestyle is a human expression, not so much a Scottish or a Scandinavian or a African or a New Zealander tradition. It's just what humans do and have always done. And I don't know, I really did appreciate that connection. Learning about their history was really fascinating to me too. And they dive into the language, the vernacular of the Maori culture, which was more Maori. I don't know if I'm saying it right. But anyway, very, very interesting stuff. My biggest complaint, I should say, is that it's not very long. Like, it's under 300 pages. And I think it might be on or around 200 pages or something like that, which is way too short. I think it might just be over 200. But in either case, it's very, very short. Far too short than what New Zealand deserves. The whole story is focusing around the idea that this is a little known country that was actually absent on most world maps for a very long time because it was so disconnected from all other human existence on the planet. And that was a bit of a pride and a bit of a sticking point for those who live in New Zealand. I mean, now the fact that there is so much there, I wanted to spend more time there. And arguably the Men in Kilts TV show, that first season where they were in Scotland, I think ran like 8 to 12 episodes. The one in New Zealand was 4. I don't think it went over 4 episodes, which is not enough to explore, especially now they covered all of that in the book, but there must be more to experience. Graham McTavish does a really, really great job in this novel, presenting the history of the island. They should have done more of that. They visited like a cultural center on one of the episodes, but it just wasn't enough. I want to see some of those hakas. I want to see different hakas. I want to, those sort of war dances that they do. I don't know if I'm saying it right. I might not be. But I just think the culture is wildly fascinating. And there should have been more history involved with experiencing, the sort of the culture that is New Zealand. And you could have padded out another 3 or 4 episodes in the TV series and then the book. And that's my biggest complaint about this is it's not enough. You give us a taste and then you don't let us indulge in it. I want to indulge. I still think it's worth reading if you are someone who enjoys generic history and humorous experiences. Then, and if, of course, if you like these 2 actors or you like the Men in Kilts TV series or you like Outlander TV series, then yeah, you should definitely read this because you would be a fan of them. You should definitely read this just for the exposure to what New Zealand has to offer as far as this sort of minimal glossing over of what they present. It's pretty damn fascinating. I really, really appreciate it. So it was colonized in the 18th century by the Scots. Of course, it's attributed to the British because it was the British who threw the Scots out after, all of the the Highland culture was outlawed, and after the Battle of Culloden. And then most Scots went over to Canada, and then from Canada, they just sort of sailed around the world, and they ended up getting to New Zealand and colonizing New Zealand a little bit. It was always, that sort of religious-driven thing because when the Roman Catholic Church came up and really hit the UK, the British Isles hard, it was either convert or die. So, and literally, the witch burnings in Scotland were what witch burnings are seen as everywhere around the world. That's where it happened, and it was the worst up in Scotland, whereas we see like Salem, Massachusetts, only a small handful of witches were actually burned, and none of them were actual witches. So, you sort of see this culture being exported of religious fervor and fear being exported to the colonies, whether it's the Canadian colonies or whether it's the American colonies. And then, of course, that witch fear and fervor, sort of terror, is then exported around the world from there. But I'd argue it really started heavy in Scotland. And I think history bears that out as well. The Maori were wild about their tribal fighting. And, there was one Maori that was brought over to England and allowed to meet the Queen. And so he went back to New Zealand. He was like, we should have a king. All these tribes are fighting. Let's all get behind a king. And no one wanted to do it. And so it was more fighting, trying to set up its own kingdom and stuff. It was very, very interesting. And then it talks a lot about the different massacres that took place in New Zealand, of which there was a handful they discussed. I'm sure there was infinitely more. But in some cases, it was just misunderstanding. Like, a lot of these Europeans would come down and the tribes would come out and greet them, doing their haka dances and stuff, basically telling them, hey, simmer down. We don't know who you are yet, because they still believe in some, sort of third world Bronze Age myths and stuff about imaginary, ghosts and people and stuff like that. So they weren't sure whether they were real or whether they're fairies or something. Because again, they'd never seen them before. And then, the English would be like, oh, they're welcoming us. So they sort of push in, and then all of a sudden they're getting murdered by these local tribes simply because they just didn't understand the cultures, because the languages don't mesh, completely different languages, which I found very interesting as well. Ultimately, I think my favorite parts of this novel was the back and forth between Graham and Sam. And really, I think the strength, that what they did more in this one, I thought, was talk about the crew, the small crew that went with them. And I appreciate that. A little behind the scenes type information goes a long way, because not only are you acknowledging that you didn't do this on your own, which of course you didn't, but you're also celebrating the other people who did help you create it. And that is important. So I really appreciated that. The reality is Sam is constantly trying to push Graham into uncomfortable situations to get over his own fears, or to just make humorous situations where Graham's going to freak the hell out. And he did. And it's hilarious every single time. I know Peter Jackson did the intro to this because Peter Jackson and Graham McTavish, of course, have worked together with the Hobbit trilogy. And he was a big fan, of course, of Graham and the Clanlands first novel and the Men in Kilts TV series in Outlander. But he had straight up said, look, sometimes I thought Sam was going a little too far with the jokes and pushing and ribbing and stuff. And that's what friendship is. That's how all of my friends are. We go a little bit too far and then a little bit more when it comes to busting each other's chops. And that's how you know you're good friends, is that you know your boundaries. You'll fucking step those boundaries from time to time, but it's always out of love and care. It's not out of hatred or animosity. And that's an important note to take, because I grew up not really understanding wit or comebacks or verbal bantering. And it was my friends busting on me where I learned how to do it back. And it made me very good at it. So now I can just tear them up just as much as they tear me up. I enjoy that camaraderie, whether it's boys or girls, it doesn't matter. It's just the fact that you're friends taking the shit out of each other, taking the piss. So seeing them do that in this novel was really fun. And it just had a highlight, one of those highlights for me. Learning about New Zealand was great. The parallels to the Scottish culture were great. Their dynamic is great. And again, if you like the TV series, it's a nice way of sort of revisiting the TV series in a different way without really retreading old ground, because it's not so much focusing on the experience that you watch them have. It's about the inner dialogues and the experiences, how they felt during the experiences that you couldn't really capture on camera, but you can definitely extrapolate through with the written word. It's a lot of fun. So I highly recommend it. I ended up giving this thing, I think, 4 out of 5 evil eyes. There are flaws. If you don't like the actors or New Zealand or Scotland, or you don't like, humor, then you're probably not going to enjoy this. But if you like all of that stuff or some of it, I highly recommend you check out Clanlands in New Zealand. And that is going to do it for this episode review of Clanlands in New Zealand. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, like it or not, evil spelled backwards is live. So get out there and be evil.